Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Torsten Bell. I'm the Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation. Now, those of you that are regulars at Resolution Foundation events will know that we talk about all aspects of economic policy, and that can occasionally be a bit grim. The wage stagnations, cost of living crisis, that's the kind of bread and butter of lots of what we're talking about at these events. And in think tank world, in policy making, like in life, it's very important to grab a celebration where one can be found, any opportunity, and today is one of those, because on Monday the national living wage is rising from £10.42 to £11.44 an hour, and more importantly, it's the UK minimum wage, the wage floor's 25th birthday. I am not holding this for fun or because I have excessive self-respect. It is because we are going to celebrate. Those of you that turned up in person, well done. That is why you got some cake. Those of you that watched online, as in many examples, there are downsides to this new work from home culture. And one of them is you didn't get any cake. But we're still glad you have joined us. Now, we've come a long way in those 25 years. The minimum wage has grown up a lot. It hasn't got the wear and tear of middle age yet. There's no sign of wrinkles, hair loss, or a beer belly. In fact, it's been a triumph in general, and so we're going to celebrate, which is why you got the cake, to give you the belly. Now, the team got very anxious at this point because they said only the birthday boy can blow out the cake. And the minimum wage isn't here because it's a policy. So we're going to try this and turn this out, I think. There we go. Oh, shit. Right. That's all the cake gags are done now. You've stayed with it. I'm very impressed with you all. Now, this is now back to a serious event. There's going to be charts and not cake. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to step back and we're going to talk about how has the minimum wage changed? How has it changed Britain? And then the hard bit, what comes next? Now, all of you can do that. You can go onto Slido to ask the questions and to vote in some polls later on. So it's hashtag minimum wage on Slido, hashtag minimum wage. And then we've got a great panel to do it. Because stepping back, if you think about the minimum wage and you think about where it came from and where it's gone, then you start with, and we would say this, wouldn't we? But you start with a load of labour economists back in the 1990s whose work changed how people thought about a minimum wage, who produced work showing that you could have a minimum wage and it wouldn't necessarily cost jobs. So you're obviously at the Resolution Foundation, there's loads of labour economists here, so you can hear from one of them. But politics created the minimum wage, reminding everyone that politics can make a difference, and social partnership has sustained it. That's mainly through the low pay commission made up of worker, employer and expert members. So we've got a good panel that goes across all of those groups. So you're going to hear from Kevin Hollingrake, who's the Minister of State for Enterprise Markets and Small Business, and who you're all going to clap, not because you're a bunch of sycophants, but because he got promoted yesterday. So congratulations, Kevin. In lots of ways, the cake was for you too. Although you were very abstemious, you didn't touch a thing. Then you're going to hear from Rain Newton-Smith, who's the Director General of the CBI, and from Paul Novak, who's the General Secretary of the TUC. These guys are the representatives of our social partnership. And in representing labour economists, you're first of all going to hear from Nia Comenetti, who is a Principal Economist at the Resolution Foundation. And despite what The Guardian said this morning, a man. Nia, over to you.
Yeah, I don't think The Guardian has heard of Nia Bevan, but yeah, I was a she in the writer this morning. So yes, happy birthday to the minimum wage. Start off by saying that what happens on Monday is a big deal before we come to the landmark nature of the day. So in cash terms, the minimum wage, the adult minimum wage is going to go up by 9.8%. That's the little gold diamond over on the right-hand side there. That'll be the third biggest ever percentage annual change. And in real terms, it's also very hefty because inflation's now falling fast. So although we don't know exactly what the inflation number is going to be in April, it's probably going to be around 2%, which would give a real terms increase of just below 8%. So that's a really significant pay boost for around 1.6 million workers who are paid on the minimum wage, and also the many other workers who are paid above the minimum wage, whose pay will also rise as employers preserve pay differentials. So it's a big day if you're a low earner, but it's also a big day if you're a fan of policy making. So this is the bit where we look backwards. So the minimum wage is now a very radical policy, but it started out very cautiously. So here are the bites of minimum wages in different OECD countries over time. Here we're using the bite as compared to full-time median pay among full-time workers, which is not how we do it in this country. So that's why the levels are a bit different. But you can see that way back there in 2000, the UK introduced its minimum wage at a kind of low to middling level compared to other countries. So that was £3.60 an hour. We were roughly in line with the OECD median, but below countries like France and New Zealand, which at that time already had much higher minimums. But over time, this policy has grown into something more ambitious. So that little kink you can see there, that was the 17th birthday of the minimum wage. When I turned 17, I started going to pubs. When the minimum wage turned 17, it got rocket boosters and we started increasing it much more substantially. And then we've carried on doing that since then. To give you the picture version of the same, you can kind of tell the story in the sort of changing faces of the politicians who've been in and around minimum wage policy over this period. So in 1992, there was obviously a fierce debate about minimum wage. It was part of Labour manifesto, but there was lots of discussion about potential job losses, so it didn't happen then. Then it was introduced by New Labour, as I said, at a cautious level. And then it became much more ambitious under Osborne and more ambitious still under Phil Hammond. Okay.
I wonder what Phil Hammond did. Probably won't remember.
So the Phil Hammond policy what he announced in 2018 was that the bite would rise from 60% of median hourly pay to 2/3. So that has set the policy during this 2020 to 2024 period, and that is what the LPC think they will achieve this year by raising the minimum wage to £11.44. The George Osborne targeting period was raising it from a bite of sort of 55-ish% to 60%. So we had these two periods of ramping up the bite of the minimum wage by a target. Okay. So what has that done? Well, surprise, surprise, if you raise the wage floor, you boost pay for low earners. One way of showing that is in the shape of pay growth. So here I'm showing you how pay has grown at different points of the hourly pay distribution in different periods over the last 40 or 50 years. So in the gold line there, you can see overall pay growth was higher. That's because productivity grew faster at that time, but it was much faster at the top than at the bottom. So high earners saw their pay rise about 2 or 3 times faster than the lowest earners, and that picture has been completely changed in the minimum wage era, where overall pay growth has slowed, but it's been much faster at the bottom than at the top. So that number at the left there is the 10th percentile. In real terms, every year pay's been going up on average by about 1.6%. At the top of the distribution, as you can see, much, much slower. So that's what happens when you raise the wage floor. A slightly more concrete way of showing you the same thing is what has happened to the pay of some specific low-paying jobs. So overall, as I'm sure you're very well aware, we've had a bit of a pay growth problem in this country over the last 10 or 15 years. So that black line is showing you, in real terms, median hourly pay, and it did grow, but then after the financial crisis it has been flatlining. But that hasn't been the case for some low-paying occupations. So you could show, obviously, any number of these. Here I've just picked out bar staff, cleaners, and sales assistants, 3 low-paid jobs whose pay has risen much faster than pay overall. And importantly, whose pay has kept on rising in the post-financial crisis era, unlike most of the rest of us. Okay. Sorry, I'm having slight difficulty getting through the clicker. So that's why it's looking slightly slow. Okay, so that's all well and good, but obviously we want a minimum wage policy which boosts pay and doesn't then cost jobs. So I'm sure you'll all be very familiar with the fact that we do think that has happened. Obviously these are contested, and every week there's another paper published in Economics Journal saying that the employment effect is one thing or another. The best thing we can do is usually look across the whole of those, take the consensus view, and that continues to be that there haven't really been employment effects, or if there have been, they have been small. Now, I was thinking, what way can I illustrate this other than by saying there are papers which show no effects? This is an illustrative way of showing it. So here we've got the change in employment rate on the vertical axis over the last 25 years, and you've got the pay level on the x-axis, and all the dots are different segments of the population, so high or low skilled people, young or old, and in different parts of the country. And basically what I'm saying here is there hasn't really been much relationship over this period between pay level and change in employment. But this is the kind of thing which, as I said, is explored in much finer detail in a voluminous literature on this question. Okay, this all came as a surprise. Obviously, back in the 90s, like I said, fierce debate, but even in recent years, as new ambitious minimum wage policies have been announced, that there are usually warnings around job losses, and in fact, it's still a standard part of the OBR's forecasting that higher minimum wages do have some kind of employment effect. So this has all been a process of economics as a profession kind of slowly changing its mind about how the labour market works and adopting slightly more sophisticated views of the labour market, in particular taking greater account of employer power, often called monopsony power. Now, I only wanted to do this for a bit of fun, which is just to say that this isn't a particularly new idea. The idea that employers have power over workers has been around for a long time. Can anyone guess which young whippersnapper said this, highlighting the importance of employer power in thinking about pay setting? Any guesses? Churchill, very good. So this was Churchill back in 1999.
It's not fun if you say it straight away.
Talking about the need for wage boards. So this is what we had before we had the minimum wage for 80 or so years. Okay.
Wait helps sometimes.
So what next? So actually, literally just 10 minutes ago, I heard that the government has said what it wants to do next year. So this slide is already out of date, sadly. And I think the news is that the remit for the Low Pay Commission is going to be to hold the bite steady for next year. I thought that wasn't going to be the case. I thought the election was going to see both parties coming forward with promises for high minimum wages. So that's very interesting. So further uprating, if it happens, now that would be very welcome because, as I've just showed you, that has a very large effect on low-paid workers. But we will have to move cautiously, given that we're already at the upper end when it comes to other countries. And we will probably have to start thinking much more seriously about trade-offs when it comes to employment, prices, sectoral shifts, and so on than we have in the past. And then thirdly, we should really start turning our attention to areas of employment policy which have been neglected for quite a long time. So we've got the minimum wage, it's its birthday, but it's not all about the minimum wage. It's important when you have a birthday party to look after other people too. And I think we should think about security of hours and sick pay. All right, that's all from me. Thank you.
Very good, Nye. Thank you. All the best birthday parties include discussion of sick pay. That's why people love having Nye around. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be part of this esteemed panel. Obviously, yourself, Torsten, and I, but also Rain and in Paul. And Paul and I actually have a common background. At some point in our lives, we were both estate agents. That's true.
I'll explain more later.
Paul's clearly gone on to
Stop
much
trying
better
to hide.
things, going
Stop trying to hide
to
from
the
the
trade
past.
unions. I am an estate agent turned politician. I'm probably the only person who's entered Parliament and improved his social standing. But it's great to be here, and it's great to celebrate what's been achieved on this 25th anniversary of the introduction of the minimum wage. And there were, of course, voices that opposed the introduction of the minimum wage, including, of course, in my party. But I understand why they did, looking back, although their concerns largely have proved to be unfounded. But Churchill quote, there's always a Churchill quote in virtually every speech, but it will be one in mine as well. And he said that some people see private enterprise as a predatory tiger that needs to be shot. Some people see private enterprise as a cow that they can milk. Few people see it for what it really is, and that's a strong horse that pulls the whole cart. And we should never forget that. So it's understandable, therefore, there were concerns around what the impact on business would be. I'm unashamedly an advocate of business because I think that clearly there's a symbiotic relationship between business and workers anyway. And I was in business myself for 30 years prior to entering Parliament. So at Minister for Small Business, we do trying to make sure that the burdens placed on business are as minimised wherever possible. But the key thing is a balance, of course, and I think it's good to see the evidence shows we're probably striking a balance. It's very important we maintain that balance. I mean, part of that balance has meant that there are 4.2 million more people in work today than there were in 2010, and indeed 1.2 million fewer people unemployed looking for work. So really good to see that. And it's fair to say that some of the gloomy predictions that were made 25 years ago haven't come to pass. And we have doubled down on that initial work, the brave introduction, I think it's fair to say, of the minimum wage. to move to the national living wage, as Nye was saying, George Osborne, greater protections for workers, and ensuring people can receive at the very least, a wage that keeps up with the total daily costs of modern lives. Of course, there will be a debate about what the level statutory wages should be set at. Goes back to my point about striking a balance, ensuring that workers receive a good, fair wage while making sure that businesses who employ them can do so comfortably and can run profitable businesses. Indeed, one of the best arguments in favour of removing unnecessary regulatory burdens of all SMEs, that it gives them greater financial flexibility to pay their workers higher wages. All regulations are ultimately paid for by consumers, so the more profits businesses make, hopefully that is shared with their workers. As you're aware, the government set this ambitious target, as Nye was saying, in 2019 to increase the national living wage to 2/3 of median wage. We're very proud of achieving that, of course, ending low hourly pay for those on the national living wage as defined by the OECD. I'm very proud to be responsible for the work as a minister who had previously run a business, and in terms of me being stood here and saying those things. I've always, as a business person, and I believe most business people do, try to do what's best for their staff, and clearly there's a productivity benefit from that, as well as in terms of what most business people want to see from their businesses, which is a positive legacy, and that's something that's certainly very important to me. So in terms of where we go forward from here, clearly, as Nye was saying, it's interesting to see where we go to in terms of the future direction of travel in terms of the national minimum wage. We have set this, we've maintained the position at 2/3 median wage for this next year, and that's our work with the Low Pay Commission, which I pay tribute to in terms of the work they do, because we're trying to make sure we strike that balance. And I think many people can see, due to some of the problems, the costs of doing business, higher inflation, as well as things like where the economy has been over the last few years, driven by COVID and the cost of living crisis, there are many businesses that do find life difficult right now, particularly in the hospitality and retail sectors. But the presence of a minimum wage creates a foundation upon which employers set higher and more competitive wages, which means businesses strive to pay their workers as much as possible rather than setting the minimum level possible. The last 5 years have been unprecedented in the UK and the world, and we still reach this historic achievement by hitting our target that was set in 2019. The national living wage has delivered a real terms pay increase for millions of workers time and time again. It's worth repeating that by April, its cash value will have increased by around 71% since it was announced in 2015. By comparison, CPI inflation rose by around 32% between 2015 and the end of 2023. But it's fair to say the labour market has changed massively over the past quarter of a century. In 1999, the minimum wage was set at £3.60 an hour for those aged over 22, as well as a lower rate of £3 for those 18 to 21. Back then, the proportion of jobs on low hourly pay was 22%, but now that figure stands at 9%, and we expect around 3 million workers to benefit directly from the pay rise they will receive on Monday. Of course, uplifting the rates is only one part of the picture. For true effectiveness, we need to enforce the payment properly so that workers get what they are due and businesses are not unfairly undercut. We know there's always more to do, as colleagues at the Resolution Foundation have reminded us, which is why government is proud of its support of HMRC's enforcement of the minimum wage, which we remain very grateful for. Indeed, since the advent of the minimum wage, HMRC and its predecessor have completed over 87,000 investigations, and the work of their enforcement officers has ensured we've returned over £170 million in arrears and issued £86 million in financial penalties. And we have doubled the resources available to the HMRC enforcement team. In fact, we can see the effectiveness of the naming scheme through the strength of feeling expressed those who are trying to remove themselves from the publication list, which we resist very strongly. including the more than 500 published just last month. We've now named over 3,200 employers for underpaying their minimum wage. Looking ahead, we know how important it is to base our decisions about the future of the minimum wage on evidence, and we support the LPC fully, and we're pleased to publish the new remit to the Low Pay Commission earlier today. As Nye said, that's been set at 2/3 of minimum earnings for this year again. We believe this is a sensible approach at this turbulent time. We want to protect the progress made in ending low hourly pay for those on national living wage in recent years, but we know it is also a difficult time for businesses. We should not only pay tribute to them for their contribution to ending low pay and signposting their workers, but also we should also take this opportunity to examine any emerging developments in the labour market, to closely examine the impacts of the recent increases to the rates. To conclude, the national minimum wage and national living wage have given huge security to our workforce. They've ensured that we strike a balance between making sure workers are fairly paid, but also that businesses can maintain a well-paid workforce while being able to function, turn a profit and maintain investment. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kevin. Rain, over to you.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, careful.
Yeah, don't trip. Thank you, Torsten, and thank you, Minister Hollinwright and the Resolution Foundation for bringing us all together for cake. It's absolutely brilliant to be here with the TUC, the CBI and the government to celebrate the anniversary of what our organisations coming together can achieve together. It's not the only example of the impact that social partnership between unions, business and government can have, but it's certainly a very important one. I remember vividly the hard work we all did developing and improving the job retention scheme during COVID, which helped to support over 9 million jobs. It's so powerful when unions and businesses stand together as a collective voice. And today I want to talk about where I think we can use that partnership approach again, not just around a living wage, but around a living standard strategy. But first, to give that in context, and I know many will be doing this today, I want to say a bit about how the national minimum wage was introduced and its impact. It didn't, as we've already heard, come out of nowhere. It was the result of painstaking groundwork, founding the impartial Low Pay Commission, gathering hundreds of expert submissions, drawing on global comparisons from countries who had already done it. And that gave the CBI at the time the confidence to back it alongside the TUC, which gave the minimum wage deep roots in UK economic policy. And since then, it and the national living wage have helped millions of people a year. And most of all, as we've heard from Nye and others and the Resolution Foundation, it absolutely reversed the injustice of earnings at the lower end of the labour market, growing more slowly than those at the top. And now wage inequality is falling, and those on the lowest wages have seen their annual pay increase by up to £6,000. And that's a huge achievement. That's partnership and evidence-led policy really delivering for people. But I don't need to tell you, though, and we've seen a bit of it already, just how different the world was when the Minimum Wage Act was passed in July 1998. And I feel that this reference is going to age, or at least unfairly show all of our ages. But some of you may or may not remember it's when Blur had just headlined Glastonbury. The Truman Show had just hit cinemas. And I was a fresh-faced student of economics and philosophy at university. But the economy I was studying then was a very different beast from the economy we have now. In 1998 as a whole, growth was 3.4% in the UK, actually down from 5% the year previously. And of course, that's higher than the US growth was last year. Inflation too was just 1.6%. And of course, if you compare that to today, where growth has been stagnant, and in January, growth fell by 0.3% on the year. Meanwhile, inflation is still high at 3.4%, though thankfully quite a way down from its recent peak at near 11%. And I think we all know some of the events that led to that eye-wateringly high inflation: the pandemic, global supply chain pressures, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All of those played a part in high inflation, and all with an impact on living standards here in the UK, beyond some of the harrowing humanitarian impact. Half of families in the UK say their cost of living is still rising, and that's not only those on the national minimum or living wage. It's people in the middle of the earnings distribution who are being squeezed as well. And it might be tempting to think that minimum wage policies alone can ease that, but the fact is they can't solve it alone. Improving living standards needs to go hand in hand with a long-term strategy for sustainable growth and productivity. And it's here where we need to look at the other side of the story and the voice of business and some of our members. They too have been hit hard by inflation, by pipeline cost pressures, from big firms to some of the smallest SMEs, whose margins are often thinner and their resilience is lower. Businesses are also being squeezed. So when the national living wage increased last April, nearly half of the firms affected told us that they had to pass that on through price rises. And more members are worried about the increase next month, how they can accommodate it against a weak economic backdrop and growing pressure on their bottom line. And that means firms don't always have the headroom to invest, to spend on tech and innovation that can actually raise productivity. And in fact, we know business investment is set to fall by 5% this year. And that matters because in the long term, productivity growth is the only effective and sustainable way to raise living standards. And so that's the dial that we all need to shift. And to do that, what we want is a living standards strategy that's not just set for 1998, but really focuses on where we are now in 2024. A holistic strategy that drives up wages and supports household incomes by powering productivity. And to my mind, there are two parts to that. First, we need government action to boost the supply side of our economy and help to reduce some of those price pressures in areas like energy and housing, for example, where we know that clogging in our planning system, that unclogging some of those barriers could help get more low-carbon homes built, to bring down rents and mortgages and improve energy efficiency. We know better grid connections could help unlock investment in green technologies. And we think this is really important. And we think the Low Pay Commission should continue to be part of this story. With the national living wage rise and expansion next month, it will have hit its target, as we've heard already, of 2/3 of median wage. That is a huge cause for celebration, and we need to maintain the progress it has achieved. It's vital that we keep the central role for the LPC and a shining example of expertise and social partnership in action. The LPC, we know, needs to have a remit to make sure the lowest pay continue to share in the benefits of growth by continuing to track 2/3 of median pay, and great to hear the announcement that will continue for another year. Meanwhile, business and government should focus on that long-term strategy to raise growth and productivity while ensuring a transition to a cleaner, greener economy, because that's how you sustainably raise the minimum wage and living standards across the board. So that's the second part of the strategy. We need government to create the conditions where businesses can play their part, to invest more in skills, in technology and innovation to drive productivity growth through a real long-term industrial strategy. And that's about giving investors confidence with a 10-year trade and investment strategy, building on the Harrington Review and focusing on our trading sectors, and a net zero investment plan that crowds in catalytic private sector investment. And it's about empowering our political leaders to raise living standards too, through a commitment to leave politics to one side and show how UK metro mayors can help become an alliance for economic growth around the UK. That's our vision, a partnership for productivity to boost real pay with a national living wage so everyone gets their fair share. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Very good. Right, you can't have a partnership without two tangoing or whatever it is. So, Paul, do some tangoing.
Well, thanks, Torsten, and thanks for the opportunity to say a few words to mark the 25th birthday of the national minimum wage. Although I have to say, when you started talking about beer bellies and hair loss and wrinkles, I began to feel a little bit targeted. I know a few other people looked a bit uncomfortable in the room. Listen, 25 years ago, I had just started out working for the TUC, and I had come from a succession of low-paid, insecure, temporary jobs. As Kevin mentioned, I had a short stint as the world's most unsuccessful estate agent. I was a hotel night porter. I worked in a warehouse. I was a call centre worker. I think on every single one of those jobs, it was £2.50 an hour, £2.60 an hour, £3 an hour. And I was one of the lucky ones. I mean, we had garment workers in sweatshops that were on 59p an hour. We had staff working in care homes on 7-night shifts on £159 a week, £1.34 an hour. This wasn't Dickensian Britain, this was Britain in the mid-90s. So it is important that we start by remembering and celebrating the positive impact that the minimum wage had, an impact on nearly 2 million workers who got a pay rise as a direct result of that policy. It is now widely acknowledged as one of the biggest policy successes of our time. I think I will help claim credit for it. Thanks to unions, thanks to the Labour Party, thanks to anti-poverty campaigners, it came into being. We shouldn't kid ourselves that there was a consensus around the minimum wage 25 years or more ago. And Ray, I am not going to hold you responsible for everything the CBI said all those years ago. But right up until 1995, the CBI was warning that the minimum wage would cause rising prices, business closures and unemployment, that it would undermine flexibility and was a poor way to tackle poverty, argued that new employees shouldn't be entitled to the minimum wage until they'd done 6 months of work. And it wasn't just the CBI. Britain was full of employers and employers' organisations predicting that the minimum wage would cause mass unemployment and economic ruin. NatWest claimed that it would be a policy that would see good small businesses squeezed out. The North East Chambers of Commerce said, with a straight face, that 50% of employers would cut their workforce. And the National Federation of Newsagents said that the jobs in their industry would be cut by a half if the minimum wage was £3.60 an hour. And it wasn't just businesses. So Kevin, there are too many quotes from Conservative parliamentarians at the time for me to mention. Let me just mention my two favourites. John Redwood, who was then the Shadow Business Secretary, claimed that what Labour was doing was kicking away the ladder of opportunity for many people who wish to climb it. The policies that it espouses will destroy jobs. And Damien Green claimed the national minimum wage was not only wrong, but immoral, because it deludes people that it's an attack on poverty and it will not reduce poverty. They were both wrong. In fact, all of the naysayers were wrong about the positive impact of the national minimum wage. Instead, it started off at £3.60 an hour, no loss of jobs, no economic meltdown. It's been raised significantly over the years, no loss of jobs. And history, I think, has proved all of those doomsday warnings emphatically wrong. And I think there are lessons that we can draw from that. And so here's 3 lessons that I would take away. First of all, the national minimum wage was a bold policy initiative, and we need to be equally bold and ambitious for its future as well. So we are at 2/3 median earnings. The TUC was disappointed today that the government didn't set a bolder remit for the LPC. We believe it should set a target of 75% of median pay. That would move us quicker towards where we believe we need to be, which is a £15 an hour minimum wage across the economy. That would raise the pay of millions of people. It would make the national minimum wage a real living wage, or the national living wage a real living wage. And I think it's just to say this, because it is important at events like this. I don't think there are many people in this room who believe or would have the lived experience that thinks, even though there's been a significant increase in the national living wage, that £11.44 is a wage that you could raise your family on or build a sustainable future on. So I think there is a challenge there for us all. Second lesson I would draw. Sometimes we do have to face down those whose instinctive reaction is to say no to measures that improve the lives of working people. And that is vital if we are going to deliver a changed world of work, a new deal for working people in this country, and I would argue that we need one. Nye touched on this at the end of his presentation. 1 in 9 workers in this country on an insecure contract of one form or another. Record numbers of young people on 0 hours contracts. 70% of the kids who live in poverty in this country have working parents. And so I think it is right. The New Deal is the right thing to do, not just morally, but economically as well. It does establish a level playing field for employers. It stops decent employers by being undercut by the cowboys. But I have to say, just like the national minimum wage, there are some employers and employers' organisations that have talked about the potential of potentially economic apocalypse if Labour's New Deal was made law. And I have to say, those arguments were wrong 25 years ago, and I think the arguments are wrong today. The arguments are the same. It'll cost jobs. It'll put employers out of business. It'll reduce flexibility. I did a little thing on the Today programme with Kate Nichols from the Hospitality UK at the start of the week. And Kate is someone I have a huge amount of genuine respect for, a really effective voice for the hospitality industry. But I think on this issue, she and others are wrong, whether it's 0 hours contracts or whether it's day one employment protections. Again, just to remind people, the British Hospitality Association back in 1995 said that the national minimum wage would cost 32,000 jobs. It would decimate the industry. Spoiler alert, it didn't happen. And they were wrong then, and I think they're wrong now. So I think it's essential that Labour in particular resists the out-of-touch, out-of-date siren voices of the 1990s. It is time to forge a new consensus about how we tackle insecure employment in this country and deliver that New Deal in full. Third and final point from me, or third and final lesson that I would draw, Ray mentioned this, I think it's really important. The national minimum wage has succeeded because it has been underpinned by a healthy dose of what you might unfashionably call social dialogue or social partnership, might even more unfashionably call it European-style social dialogue. But employers, unions, academics, working with government have made the minimum wage a success. And I think we could do with more of that approach. It's an approach that our members and the people we aspire to represent desperately need, because our flexible labour market, so-called flexible labour market, is failing far too many working people. It's led to massive rewards in Britain's boardrooms, but not for everybody else. Real wages, we know, no higher in real terms than they were in 2008. It has unleashed this epidemic of insecure work and in-work poverty. It's undermined our efforts to drive up productivity and investment. So I believe very passionately it's time for a new approach. It's time to learn the lessons from the national minimum wage, to forge that new consensus and to deliver a new deal for working people. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. What's really good is that you've all, particularly Paul, particularly you at the end, you've really stuck to the theme of a family birthday party, because it's really important to relitigate old family feuds at all the best birthday parties.
I've been in enough family parties. I know what's needed.
Delivered,
if the police aren't called, it's not been a good night.
Right. On that note, we've got half an hour, guys. I'm hoping we're going to avoid that. I'm not sure we're insured for that. Anyway, right, I'm going to kick us off with a poll.
You're the one provided in the wine and beer.
Yeah, you've had one drink each, right? It's that kind of birthday party. Right. Now, we're going to start with a poll to get us a bit perkier. It's going to come up on the screen. You can vote online. As I said, go onto Slido and it's hashtag minimum wage. But those, oh my God, you can't actually read it all. Right, those of you here, I'm going to tell you what the options are. What has been, we started with an assertion that the minimum wage may be the most successful economic policy of a generation. But what do you guys think has been the most successful? So, minimum wage, Bank of England. Rain mentioned the furlough scheme. I put the cycle to work scheme in here because it's rubbish. It's a terrible policy. I was involved in that one. The auto-enrolment is a serious option, introduced in the last decade. Huge increase in people saving for pensions. The triple lock on pensions. You looking happy, people? Yeah. Jeremy Hunt's promised that one's staying. Eat out to help out, possibly tongue-in-cheek. The degrowth definitely needs to be considered. Anyone in the room want to self-identify as a degrowther? None of you? Not one? Well, there are degrowthers out there, and they have got exactly what they wanted in terms of no wage growth for 15 years. So very successful that's been. That's the last one. Or you can vote for something else, but we're not really a democracy, so those are the options. So let's go round the panel and get their views while people get a chance to consider to vote. Now you get paid by us, so I'll give you least time to think. What's your top?
Well, I think probably the minimum. I was thinking about how do you judge that? I think it would either be how much difference has been made, or how inevitable was it that some kind of policy along those lines would have happened. I.e., if it was happening in every single country in the world, then it was almost certainly going to happen here at some point. So I don't know. Yeah, I think minimum wage or Bank of England independence, and because I like raising pay for low workers, it's going to be minimum wage. But those two would be the ones.
Right, Paul.
Oh, so we're allowed two.
No, you're not.
Well, Nye was very clear. He set a precedent.
He's ill-disciplined, so come on.
I mean, Ray mentioned before the impact of the furlough scheme, and without it, 10 million people and their families would have seen catastrophic, not just the loss of their livelihoods, but potentially sort of longer-term impacts in terms of mass unemployment. The furlough scheme, over a short period of time, absolutely crucial. But the national minimum wage, I would put as the biggest long-term intervention that's probably had the most direct impact on the most people.
Very good. Rain, what's your favourite?
Oh, well, I mean, instinctively, I was going to say
can make up
minimum
another one
wage,
as well.
but I think like, the other thing I will make. I think we're all agreed the minimum wage was a really, really important economic policy introduced here. I did start my career at the Bank of England, so I think also I will make a bid for Bank of England independence from the point of view of having. And look, we've seen the challenges of high and sustained inflation. If that had persisted, I do think, if we think back where we were before we had the Bank of England being independent, I think over the longer run, that is quite important in terms of living standards as well. So
there are lots of macroeconomic papers saying that the having of Bank of England independence has kind of boosted GDP by insert totally implausibly large effect here. And I'm not saying they're all written by central bankers. Most of them are written by central bankers, or it turns out ex-central bankers did. That would have been, I think that would be lots of people's popular answer. Kevin, last but not least, what's your favourite?
Well, I'm going to agree with Paul on the furlough scheme, mainly because my boss implemented it, so that was always a politically correct thing to say.
Very
it
sensible.
did it, as well as the jobs, 500,000 businesses through that and the COVID scheme, so really important. We'd have been playing catch-up as we were post-2008. You take the time to recover. It's not just what happens at the time. It's a 5-year fallow period you have post-2008. So hugely important. But I'm going to go for Bank of England independence because what we've seen over the last few years, I know it's a Labour policy, in the last few years has been the effects of inflation. And that's not been with us for a long time because of that. So the most important thing you can do is make sure we don't have inflation affecting our economy because it has profound effects. So that's something we should.
I thought like Jacob Rees-Mogg and some others thought that it being independent was the problem, and that's why we got the inflation.
Well, you got me rather than Jacob Rees-Mogg.
I mean, for a whole lot of reasons we have, Kevin. Yes, we have, and I'm very, very glad for that. Right, so moving on, let's have the results of the poll. See what you all voted for. Cycle to work scheme, 0. Quite right too. I'm with the people on this one, and that's rarely the case. Degrowth, 2%. Come on, people. Grow up. Right, let's do some questions. So, let's. I think we should do some of the critique because it's been a nice birthday party. Apart from Paul trying to cause a fight, it's been a nice birthday party. So let's try and do some of the critiques of has it been a complete triumph, yeah? which usually come in a number of forms. So they don't come in the it has cost jobs due to the record employment levels thing, right? But they tend to come in, okay, it didn't cost jobs, but it did some other bad things, i.e. it caused pressure to emerge in different ways. So let's just take a few of those. There's quite a few questions that are along the lines of this. I'm looking for the... Right, so Hugo asks, did it cause the 0 hours contracts rise? Okay, but let's broaden that out to, did it cause lots of employers, particularly maybe in the hospitality sector, to look to use labour more efficiently? And one of the ways they did that is to try to better match labour to demand, and that meant using contracts with flexible variable hours. It could be short hour contracts in the retail sector, 0 hours contracts in the hospitality sector. So that's Hugo's one. There was an anonymous one I wanted to bring up as well, which was basically, did it cause some of the self-employment boom? So low-paid self-employment, we've seen a big move towards the low-paid in Britain being self-employed rather than employed. They're exempt from the minimum wage. Could the minimum wage have encouraged employers to try to make people self-employed. Then I'm going to quickly rattle off some other ones. People haven't asked these ones, but I think these are important. Stress, has it pushed up work intensity? So if we look at reporting stress levels at work for low-paid workers, definitely up. Actually probably starts rising a bit earlier than the minimum wage, but anyway, definitely up. And then last one, has it pushed down other people's wages? So who wants to go first? You can go on, Paul, go.
Do I think it's caused the rise of 0 hours contracts and all the forms of insecure employment? No. Do I think quite often political attention has been taken off some of those broader issues around insecure and precarious employment and subsumed under there what's important is the headline rate of the national minimum wage? Absolutely yes. So it's great that you're on £11.44 an hour, but not if you're on a 0 hours contract or you're only doing 2 or 3 hours rather than 5 or 6 hours or whatever you might want. So I don't think there's a causal link there. On the self-employment point, I think there's certainly been a rise in bogus self-employment. And I think that's not just about the national minimum wage. This is about employers. And I have been, not to sound like a real, sort of, where were you when Blair were playing at Reading or whatever, but I've been a trade unionist for over...
Blair? I thought you said Blair. I was like...
No, not that Blair. But I've been a trade unionist for over 30 years, and surprise, surprise, employers often come up with new ruses, bad employers, to transfer risk from themselves to the people that they would ordinarily employ. And we've seen it through the rise of some of the platform companies. We've seen it through the use of 0 hours contracts. That's why I do think you have to think about these things holistically. It's not just about the headline rate of pay. It's about the broader framework of employment law. In fact, Theresa May was acknowledged that point when she asked Matthew Taylor to carry out the review of modern employment practices. Unfortunately, we didn't see an employment bill flow from that point. But
go on, finish.
So think about one sector that sums up all of these issues and how they interconnect. We've got a bizarre situation in social care where we've got 150,000 staff vacancies. The minimum wage or the national living wage is effectively the prevailing wage, and 1 in 4 staff are on 0 hours contracts. Now, adjusting the headline rate of the national living wage is important. It doesn't solve the problems in social care, and that's a much bigger set of issues, including how you fund social care, but crucially, how you challenge that model of insecure employment that underpins the whole sector.
Okay, just to push a bit though, so you set up maybe we got distracted on other stuff because people were focused on the headline rate. Does that go as far as looking ahead, your priority would be other stuff? If you had to do further hikes in the minimum wage versus progress on other bits of insecure work, which one comes first?
But you see, I don't have to do that, Torsten, because I'm a trade unionist, so I can ask for it all. I mean, the whole point
You're
is...
You're a serious person, though, Paul. You believe in trade-offs.
And I do, and I think, but I do want to see the national living wage rise, but I do want to see it also sort of the issues around insecure employment addressed. This is why I think that Labour's
This is the problem of giving you cake and telling you to eat it.
Well, no, but this is what Labour's New Deal. It's very clear, and they've said that this will be an employment bill in the first 100 days of the new Labour government. Will tackle all of these issues.
Yep.
So I mean, there are always. The value of the Low Pay Commission, for example, is that trade-off, isn't it? Make sure that increases in the national living wage don't lead to increases in employment. But actually, I think we do need to tackle some of these bigger issues around insecure employment as well.
Very good. Rain, any of these trade-offs you're worried about? Or which one are you most worried about? Given that you're probably a bit more anxious than Paul, I'm going to guess.
I mean, I think, I suppose I guess I'd stand back and say, what we need to make sure we can have sustained increases is think about that focus on growth and productivity and investment. So I think I guess that question around stress and mental health, I think is something that employees and employers are really concerned about, right? We know if you look, there's a real challenge around health in our broader economy.
But do you think firms have sweated low-paid labour more because it was more expensive in that way?
To my mind, it's more. I don't think so. That's not something I recognise. I think what it is what we want to encourage, what we want to make it easier is how businesses can invest in technology. So, because when where everyone wants to be more productive, to feel it's easier to contribute. So,
Evan, what do you reckon? Any trade-offs?
Of course, there are trade-offs, and in our position, we have to try and balance capital and labour. That's the reality of this situation, and we all have to really, if we look at this, you've got to look at this holistically. Let's not talk about bad employers, let's talk about good employers. Most good employers I speak to know how important their workforce is. So, and that's the biggest pressure you can put on will benefit workers, is having a strong employment market for workers, and that's what we've got. And we should, that's really important. We do that. We maintain that, of course. And most good employers know that they treat their employees well, because that's how they get more productive workforce and a more profitable business. We know that, but I'm not saying there aren't exceptions to that. In terms of how we tried to manage this, you talked about Matthew Taylor, the Good Work Plan. We have implemented a lot of his recommendations, including the right to request predictable terms and conditions. So that's what he recommended we did. We actually went a bit further than what he suggested. We've also put 6 other pieces of legislation in place as well, including flexible working, because again, we've got 9 million people in our economy that don't work, that could work, that are of working age. We want to bring those people back into the workplace, and making the workplace more flexible is one of the primary ways to do that. So we have tried to strike that balance. I've got to say, I do worry about the plans for day one rights, employment rights. I know you say, well, okay, you worried about this before. Don't worry, we've got it all right. Nobody's got it all right. I haven't got it all right. You haven't got it all right. We all need to learn from each other, listen to each other. I worry about some of the nations that have those kind of rights have much higher unemployment than the UK, including France. So if you give somebody a day one right, and I think any employer will tell you how difficult it is to move somebody out of the workplace if they have those rights after 2 years, as it is currently. It's a 4-stage process, plus an employment tribunal. If you're going to burden businesses with that right at the start, I do think there'll be some impact.
Just to make this concrete for people who aren't paying loads of attention to the Labour Party process, which day one right are you worried about?
Day one employment rights, so unfair dismissal.
So is that the one you're mainly worried about?
Mainly worried about. You have to, to manage somebody out, you have to go through a performance management process to manage that person out. So I'm very worried about that in terms of how that impacts workers.
Very good. Paul?
Come back.
No punch up.
No, and just come back directly on 3 points there, Kevin. I mean, first
3?
Yeah.
We haven't got time. Quick.
Very quickly, headlines. Right to request. The reality is, if you're on a short hours or 0 hours contract, on a temporary contract, working for a big global warehouse distribution firm, the right to request is no right at all, because you're worried about next week. I won't have any hours at all if I put my head above the parapet. I'm interested, actually. I mean, if you think about hospitality, between 10 and 25% of the staff in hospitality work on 0 hours contracts. That means the vast majority of employers in hospitality don't use 0 hours contracts. So what are we doing to protect those employees who are being undercut by those who do? And just finally on day one rights, the key thing is it's a protection against unfair dismissal. Nobody says that there won't be probationary periods. So the things you can do, I mean, you were at ACAS today. I think that ACAS could do to support employers and employees to make this right work. But from my point of view, we've got far too many people who employers run the clock for 23 months and then at the end of it say, we don't need you anymore. Why? Because you've got rights coming. And so we've got to find ways of supporting not just tackling the bad employers, but supporting good employers as well.
Can I clarify something? Sorry.
Oh my God.
Kevin,
absolutely no.
Probation period. Surely a day one right is a day one right.
But it's a protection against unfair dismissal, not against dismissal at all.
It's the process you have to go through to demonstrate fairness is the problem.
Well, you would say
the Labour Party is literally not even here.
And they're still.
I'm moving us on from there, causing us a lot of freaking problems. I'm moving us on. Right, Nye, I want to touch on this, which is so back in 2016. I think actually literally around the time I started this job, because I'm an old man, I've been here for ages. We surveyed loads of employers, and George Osborne had just announced the national living wage. Big increases coming about, and we asked them what they were going to do when this happened, basically. And they said, because humans are optimists, they said, we're going to raise productivity. The way we will deal with this is become more productive, and that's the main thing. So I think Saskia Otto, now this is a question for you, says, has the minimum wage helped increase efficiency or productivity by encouraging employers to invest in labour-saving technology? Which is like one of the centre-left cases for a minimum wage generally. Has anyone been to a Premier Inn recently? I highly recommend them.
Yeah.
How did you check in? Did you meet a
Actually,
human?
I did use a human being, but I have also used.
I mean, don't
their
use the human being.
But I no.
Did you talk to them?
Yeah, exactly. So it was quite
machines are
nice.
normally shut.
Unfortunately, their machines don't always work, but when they do work, it is very efficient.
Unexpected
All I'm
items
saying
in
is
the bagging area.
on budget night, when some people here may be working some long hours, and they go across the road into the soulless, grim Hub Hotel, the machine gives you your check-in card. Right, night. Anyway, what's the answer to Saskia's question?
I would very much like it to be true, but there, as yet, isn't really evidence that it is true, despite lots of people looking quite hard for it, including the Low Pay Commission. The main productivity effect that has been found, and this is in Germany, is that you put pressure on smaller, less productive firms, less productive sectors, and workers move away from those firms into the more productive ones. So there's a productivity effect, but it doesn't look like it's via firms going, I'm going to spend money on some new machines and improve productivity that way. But yeah, as in many areas of minimum wage research, people are continuing to look, and maybe at some point they'll find something.
This is one of the bits of ways of boosting productivity that, for good reasons, I'm not even going to go, Kevin, for good reason politicians don't want to talk about, which is like, in the end, some lower productivity firms going bust is how productivity rises.
It's not a zero failure system. We should be
We do definitely
about
do
that.
That's very good. That's the most capitalist thing I've heard. We do. We need some bad firms going bust. That's what we need.
Absolutely.
Right. The age, not our age or gut or hairline or the rest. Age categories. So, do you want to keep age categories? So overall, just remind everyone, minimum wage is introduced in the late 90s. One of the giving ground to the critics is to say, don't worry, guys, we'll do this slowly, lowish rate, 360. Second give is to say, we won't include the youth in it. And then we've been in a slow process of then rolling that back generally over the time period. But should we go the whole hog and get rid of all the age rates? Right.
So I think this is something we should leave to the experts on the Low Pay Commission, because that is part of the idea where you're bringing together academic experts, business, and TUC to consider that. I mean, I think, and I suppose I also say as my children get into that sort of teenage phase, and it would be great for them to sort of start to go out and work. I think one of the things we do know is we want to keep employment rates high for young people, and so I think there are things that are being balanced.
Do you know what the problem with the young people is, though? The teenagers just don't work anymore. Back in the day,
Mine do. Mine do.
The teenagers do not work.
wonder
The
if
rate
it's
of
actually-
teenagers working has gone through the
Absolutely.
floor.
But
Mine do.
Well, good. I'm glad yours do. I was working in a pub. I was one of those bar staff as a
I think
teenager.
there are-
And if I did it, you lot should be doing it.
Yeah.
I think
Sorry,
there's
I got-
fewer routes though for young
why is
for
that?
young people into work in.
Why won't
and I
firms let
think-
the youth in?
I don't know. I don't think it's. I think it's partly a matching issue as well. I'm saying this more as a parent rather than as a business leader. And I think one of the other challenges is obviously you want to support young people to be in education, and the holiday periods are short, so there isn't a huge amount of opportunity to find work, I think, for young people that gives them work experience. But what we do know from the research is the more interactions that young people have with work, the more likely they are to be employed over the long term. So how we use work experience, how we use those and get more more experience, and also when you can try different types
That's what we want.
of
Do
jobs.
you want the youth rates gone?
Yeah, I think adult workers should get the adult living wage, and I'll give you an example from the Novak Family Archives and a more scientific example. I mean, my daughter was 18, 19. She was running front of house in a local restaurant. She was on the 18-year-old minimum wage, earning £2.50 less than a 22-year-old, doing exactly the same job, no less responsibility. And I think it's interesting that if you take big companies, big retailers like Tesco's, and in fact, right across the piece, the trend is to take away those youth rates because you pay people for the job they're doing, not their age.
Was she unionised?
Well, of course she's a union member. I can't claim we had recognition.
Did she strike? Nye, what do you want done on ages?
I mean, it is obviously literally unfair, but it exists because there is this belief that employment effects are going to be bigger for young workers. So I think I agree with RAIN, and I think the LPC agrees as well. In their document today, they said they'd be up for lowering the age rate, but they'd like to do it in a gradual way.
Do it slowly. Kevin, you're going to do
Well, that's what we've done. We'll have some empirical evidence, won't we, very shortly, because we reduced it from 23 down to 21, so we'll know if it impacts the workforce. And my 21-year-old daughter's really happy.
What does she do?
She works in a pub. She's a student, but she works
Very
in a pub,
good.
in our local pub. Can I just talk about productivity just for a second? We came up before, because I think it's too early to tell whether it's going to impact. And I think it will have a positive effect on productivity, a higher minimum wage, because you will have to make sure you're still profitable. It does, of course, it adds to business costs. But I think, if you think what we've been through, not since 2008, but all the way through 2013, in terms of the impact there, Brexit 3 years after, COVID, cost of living, I don't think you can really see what's happening here, particularly because free movement of people didn't end until 2020.
Yep.
Now that is the number one pressure lots of businesses are seeing in terms of their ability to staff up their organisations, and so that is bound to drive investment and profitability, and the government's putting some significant incentives now.
This is you having like a Bidenomics approach. You want a hot labour market to drive up investment.
Yes, exactly right, and a shortage of labour, but also some incentives to invest, which you've done now through full expensing. So there should be more investment, which leads to more automation, higher productivity.
Very good. Right, in-work poverty. So let's talk about something slightly odd, which is, and people often ask this, the punters, when you go in the country. So we've had a minimum wage introduced, and it's been massively ramped up. Yeah, that's what nice charts all showed you at the beginning. But over the same time period, the amount of poverty in Britain that is in working households has gone up. What is going on? Who wants to go first?
It depends how you measure poverty. I mean,
Right,
you're probably
two-thirds of median income, yeah.
you're losing relative poverty. If you look at absolute poverty, that's not the case. There are 400,000 fewer children in poverty since we're in 2010.
No. This was not. No. I'm not having a go at this. Was not a poverty's gone up under the Tories. We can do what we want. But that wasn't what I was saying.
I missed the question.
I was saying why is if you just take poverty? Actually, it's true on either measure of absolute or relative poverty. But let's not. They're all snoozing at the back because I've mentioned relative poverty. Like the percentage of households that are in poverty that work is up, right?
Right.
So we're now. So you go back to the 1990s, you have a relatively low amount of people who are in poverty are working. The household is someone is working, and today a much larger proportion of those that are in poverty are working. What is going on?
I don't know. I mean, I think in terms of
Okay, that's good.
wait,
That's good honesty. That's fine.
absolutely. In terms of, I mean, if you look at the number of people in poverty in the UK has declined significantly over the last 15 years. About 14% of people are in absolute poverty. In relative poverty is similar in terms of the drop.
Yeah.
So the direction of travel has been there. In terms of the specifics you mentioned around in-work people in poverty, I just don't know the answer to that.
Right?
Well, look, I feel, Torsten, you're asking a question that you partly know the answer
I definitely know the answer to, but this is,
But I
don't want a
suppose
monologue here.
I'll just offer two perspectives on it. And I think it's partly what I was talking about around having a strategy not just around a minimum wage, but also around a living standards strategy and really being focused around growth and productivity. There is another element to that, which this relates to, is thinking about household incomes. And one of the things that some of our members have talked about in, particularly those, say, who are a housing association. So one housing association member talked to me about how they were within some of their housing districts were trying to run innovative schemes to get people into work who had been out of work for a long period of time. We know that being out of work is a real concern in the UK, that labour market inactivity. But one of the things is, as these schemes were becoming successful and people were working, is as they were trying to increase their hours, because of the interaction with the benefit system, and particularly we know it depends on the number of children you have, and also caring, whether you can find affordable childcare. They were finding that the cost of being in work and the rate at which some of the benefits were being withdrawn meant that they, their household incomes weren't going up relative to what they were. So they, they were sort of saying, is there something we could think about from a more holistic policy to think about how the two interact?
Very good.
Well, I think that's a really important point, as well as insecure, precarious employment and the interplay with the benefit system and universal credit. If you remove the two if you put the two cap policy on benefits for children, doesn't matter how much your headline minimum wage goes up, people are going to lose money through the benefit system. I think there's also a broader issue, as I said before, that wages overall have been stagnant for 15 years. That has an impact of those on the very lowest incomes, because we know that their living cost proportionally are much higher for them. But there's a broader issue here as well, Torsten. It goes back to the employer's point. We are effectively subsidising large numbers of low-paying employers.
I agree with that.
And that's why the national minimum wage is so important, but that's why tackling insecure, precarious employment is important as well.
Right. I'm not going to give you a monologue on the actual answer, but one thing I would just to flag is, so Nye said to you earlier, showed you that chart showing you that the distribution of pay growth has completely flipped in the last 25 years, right? So it showed you it used to be the highest earners getting the highest pay rise. Since 1999, the lowest earners have been getting the highest pay rises on hourly pay, right? And that has brought down the inequality of hourly pay really fast, yeah? So inequality of hourly pay rates is probably the lowest it's been at least since the 70s, possibly ever on record, okay? Most of that is being driven by narrowing the gap between the bottom and the middle, which is literally what the government's policy has been since 2015. They are hugely reducing it. But poverty and inequality generally, what we care about is household level incomes. And the level of, so that gets you into benefits, right? So partly it's to do with benefit rates, but it also gets you to what you care about is the inequality of household earnings. So it matters how many hours you work, and it matters who you are or aren't hooked up with. It's the technical term, right? And lower earners have relatively shifted towards working shorter hours compared to higher earners over time, pushing up wage inequality on that measure. And in general, people are hooking up with people that look more like them in terms of earnings. There are lots of other things going on. Housing costs have gone up more for higher earners, higher income households than the rest. There are many Resolution Foundation papers on this if you want. But one thing I would say is when people ask this question, it's anonymous who asked this, so I'm not having a go, but they often say they use this fact that in-work poverty has become a bigger percentage of overall poverty, and they say it shows you that work doesn't pay, and so you shouldn't think about anti-poverty strategies as being about work. And that is definitely the wrong conclusion, right? Because we have done reports, the author of one of them's here, tracking what happens to people when they move from being out of work to in work, and their chances of being in poverty fall a lot. So don't believe people when they say to you work doesn't take you out of poverty. That is still definitely does. It's just not enough to reduce poverty across the whole of society. Right, question for me then, for all four of you, which is, what's been the biggest surprise? So what has happened? We've got 25 years of this now. Lots of things have happened. Businesses said they were going to increase productivity. They haven't really. What's been the surprising thing that we've learned over those 25 years that you were wrong about? I promise to have one as well as part of this kind of, self-flagellating strategy. What have we been wrong about over those 25 years? Yours is easy because he gave you yours at the beginning. On the
not Rain personally. I wasn't paying to say that.
All right. Stop trying to dig yourself out of a hole now. Right, so you can go first, Nye, again as part of the Resolution Foundation. What have you or we, if you want to share the blame, been most wrong about over those 25 years? I can think of several things we've been definitely wrong about.
I've never made any mistakes, Torsten. I think so. On prices, just in case that comes up, I don't think that's surprising because people think wages go up, then firms pass on the cost and prices go up. But the thing to remember there is that wage costs are a fairly small part of business's overall costs, and in particular, the wage costs of minimum wage workers are a very, very small part of business overall costs. So I think you can, in general, not worry that much about price effects. Jobs effects, yes, we should worry. And I think we should all be honest and say it is surprising. If you think about the span of 25 years, we've raised labour costs massively.
You're going for the big one. It's surprising there wasn't any job losses.
I wouldn't have expected that standing in 1990.
What's yours?
Pleasantly surprised by two things. One, that there has been an emerging political consensus about the value of the minimum wage.
Look at you.
And the second thing is, I'm pleasantly surprised that the tripartite nature of the Low Pay Commission has remained.
That's a good one.
That's really important. But just to say, a little bit concerned, we don't have any serving trade unionists on the Low Pay Commission at the moment. I mean, right from the start of the Low Pay Commission, there were serving trade unionists on there. I think that's really important to have the link back to workplaces.
Okay.
The tripartite nature, really
Very
important.
good. Rain, what's your surprise?
Well, so I think where Nye started from, and I guess it's a reflection, having been, it was sort of introduced just as I was finishing studying economics, and I think there was a sort of consensus around the economics community then that if you introduced it, and particularly at a too high level, that would lead to a higher unemployment, and I think that has been has been disproven. There is, I think, a very pertinent debate now as to, now that we've reached, 2/3 as the target, and I think, in our view, it makes sense to keep that a little bit like we have the inflation target. That is the aim for the Low Pay Commission.
Yep.
But whether, how you move around that overall relative aim is into their discretion. In the same way, the Bank of England will allow inflation to go up in a year to get, their aim is to bring it to 2% over the medium term.
Okay.
And that feels about right when we look across countries as a reasonable level. And I suppose the only other bit to track back to where some people talking about, you can definitely see, I think, in smaller businesses and in some, I think for some, and this is where the minimum wage being where it is, it definitely, they are feeling the pressure in an economy at the moment which isn't doing very well. And I think smaller businesses have less resilience to deal with some of that, the rising.
Kevin, what's your surprise?
Oh, I'm really surprised John Redwood was wrong. I mean, where's that?
That is one of the biggest shocks that has occurred.
I've got to say, and from the end,
good.
you feel on a
very
political consensus. I agree with Paul. The fact that we have reached consensus on this, that this is something that we think is overall has a net benefit to the economy. I think that's great. I also think it's great that we've lifted tax thresholds for lower earners, so you can try and make sure that work does pay and encourage people into the workplace. I think it's a whole suite of measures. So I think that's the biggest surprise. It's not a bone of contention anymore.
Very good. I was going to give you the one I've been most wrong about in the recent past, which is if you go back to 2015, 2016, so this big ramp up that's going to go on for quite a few years, we did quite a lot of modelling that basically would have led you to believe that a much larger proportion of workers by 2020 would have been on the minimum wage. And staggeringly, today, about the same proportion of workers are on the minimum wage as in 2015. It's about 5%, 1 in 20. That is phenomenal. So we've massively ramped it up. It's got much closer to the middle, but firms have been under enough pressure to maintain premiums for people who do slightly more differentials, to maintain differentials, that we have not seen a growing number of. We've seen some occupations slipping much closer to it, but the number of people actually on it is not risen. Almost. It went up a bit before the pandemic, and then after the pandemic, tight labour market, it has just basically gone back to 5%. And that is a big shock, and we were definitely wrong about that, which is very rare and hard to deal with. But we can deal with it. Right, it's the end of the birthday party. I want to thank our panel for all their thoughts and all their celebrations on this, momentous occasion. So can we all thank them? And thank you all for coming as well. Remember what happens after when you're after the age of 25 for humans, is when you start getting less happy. And when do you start getting happy again? Anyone in the room about the age of 56? 56, anyone?
I was going to say mid.
That's when you start perking up by your mid-50s. So all I'm going to say is the minimum wage has got a painful 30 years ahead. Have a good day, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Toss.